Good evening, everybody, and welcome to our first discussion, really, about 2019 Burgundy. Hopefully, you've all received an email about our forthcoming series of Zoom tastings, where we're doing something slightly different this year. Obviously, with COVID, it's made things quite tricky. We've cancelled the Primeur tasting in January, and we're going to be running a series of mini on Primeur tastings, if you like, village by village, starting with Meursault on the 24th of November and running 2 per week up until Christmas time, and then offering some of those wines thereafter. So what we wanted to do tonight was really give you a little introduction to the style of the vintage, give you a little bit of an idea about what the weather was like back in 2019, who's made a real success of the vintage, the styles of the wines, how the wines might age, and whether they are typical Burgundies or not, or whether they are the new typical Burgundies. It's all to be discussed. I'm absolutely delighted to have Jasper Morris MW with me here this evening to discuss this in great detail. Jasper has been one of the authorities on Burgundy for, I would say, many years. He may not like me to say that, but he started out we set up Morris and Verdin back in 1981, where I've done my maths, Jasper. I think you were only 24 at the time, which seems,
not even, in fact.
Yeah, which seems incredibly young. And then in 2010, he wrote his acclaimed book, Inside Burgundy, and taken the name for his new website, which was launched a couple of years ago. And we would encourage you all to sign up to that. So, welcome, Jasper. Good to see you.
Thanks, Jason. I gather I was nearly going to see you this morning tasting at Gouges, but you've postponed till tomorrow.
Yeah, I was right. Double booked in Pommard and Volnay. Not that there's much wine there to taste, it seems, this year, but very, very nice wines, all the same. Hopefully the Gouges wines did themselves proud.
Oh, absolutely, yes.
Just so I don't forget later on, just so that people know how to log on to your site, in case they're not already subscribers, can you just give out the details?
Yes, thank you for the opportunity for the plug. So it's the site is called Jasper Morris Inside Burgundy, but you'll find it with www.insideburgundy.com. There are little bits and pieces you can see for free. But like other such sites, it is based on a subscription model, which is £95 a year. And of course, I should be told if you'd like to join up. I'm pretty much the only one of the critics who's living full time in Burgundy, and I've been working away busily. So far for 2019, I've put up already a report on the wines of Mâconnais. It's gone really well in the Mâconnais. Coming up shortly is Chablis, and then I will do the Côte de Beaune and the Côte de Nuits. But they'll all be ready by 31st of December, even if I have to work through Christmas, which I did last year. The idea being that you'll have all the commentaries ready in hand before the January Burgundy selling season gets open. So anyway, I would, of course, very much welcome you on board. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Jasper. Well, you mentioned there, as you say, you're currently living in Burgundy full time. It seems a really good place to start going back to January 2019 and really just talk through the whole weather for that year. It seems that we had yet another quite warm winter in Burgundy. I remember going to taste, say, 15 or 20 years ago in Burgundy. We'd often go out in January, actually, when the Primeur tastings were a little later. We could go out that late, and it was really cold. And it seems to have been a long time since they had a cold winter in Burgundy.
That's right. In fact, if you go back to 1985, it got down to -30 in January, which was pretty extraordinary. And that was enough to freeze the vines to death in some cases. I'm actually going to start a little bit before January 2019, because the new season really starts from 1st of October. And you'll remember that 2018 was a very dry summer. And it didn't rain at all during October. The first precipitation we had since the harvest was on the 30th of October when it snowed, bizarrely, before we got any rainfall. But apart from 2 or 3 odd days of snow, it was frankly a fairly mild and dry winter. And that counts a lot because the winter before 2018 was very wet. The winter before 2020 was pretty wet, and that was helpful, and that, in particular, the older vines were able to drink from the surface well below. But before the summer of 2019, there was so little winter rainfall that the vines weren't able to do that. And that explains why the yields were quite a lot down in 2019. There were plenty of grapes, but when people actually came to pick them and to press the whites and make the reds, they actually discovered there was a lot less juice than in the vintages on either side. So January was sort of warm and dry. February started colder, and we thought maybe we're going to get a bit of late winter. The second half of February was unbelievably warm. And in fact, where we live, we ate out, we had our lunch outside more often in February than almost any other month, because after April, May, it got too hot. So we had a really early start to the season, which is problematic because it means that the buds start earlier. And something that global warming has brought us, paradoxically, is a bigger frost risk. I think it's not just because the budding starts earlier, but also I suspect it's because it opens up different air currents. And I think we're getting these sudden spring bursts of cold air from the Arctic and Siberia in a way that we perhaps didn't get so much in an earlier period. So in 2019, everybody was out there. I actually joined in, but on April 13th, 14th, that night, people were up at 4 in the morning and they lit their candles in the vineyards and they started the air machines that sort of move the air to try to stop it settling in a cold place. And they lit the bundles of straw, which provides a protective haze which stops the early morning sun burning fragile, already frosted grapes. But the problem was the damage had already been done on the 5th of April, the night of the 4th, 5th, when it got below freezing even as early as 11 o'clock in the evening. And few people protected in time for that. And it turned out it didn't show the next morning because the buds were still actually covered in their sheaths. They hadn't really emerged. But it turns out that did quite a lot of damage as far south as the Beaujolais, a bit less right in the north in Chablis, a little bit. But in various places, Beaujolais, Mâconnais, and Chassagne-Montrachet, and one or two other local spots. So it was a rocky start to the season, but hard to improve.
Chassagne seems to have been much the worst affected of the 3 major white wine villages. Is that right?
Yes, I think so. Puligny seems to have come through with a decent crop. People who've got Bourgogne Blanc down at the foot in Merceau and Puligny suffered, but not the main vineyards, no.
Yeah, I mean, I've been tasting it. We now have quite a few Chassagne producers as a result of.
And they're all married to each other.
Well, pretty much, yeah. I think there's only about 3 original families.
Something like that, yeah.
But it seems some people have lost as much as 50 or 60% in 2019, which is going to be quite problematic when it comes to trying to allocate wines, obviously.
Yes. It can be misleading because sometimes they say 50% down, they mean 50% down on 2018 when they made an enormous crop. So it isn't always, right down as low as they start crying about.
And then moving on from what was potentially a disastrous frost, if you like, how was flowering generally throughout the coat?
It was a little bit tricky. The weather wasn't so good in the spring. Flowering got delayed a bit from the budding time. You might have expected a really early flowering. It was a bit later flowering than either 2018 or 2020. It was strung out with some cold weather through June. What was frequently the case was that because it was strung out and the weather was both windy and a bit cold, you had a certain amount of coulure when the grapes actually are bought, and a lot of mirandage, which our Australian, New Zealand friends called hen and chicken, meaning that quite a lot of the grapes came through as very, very small individual berries. So that was an important contributor to the fact that yields are down in 2019. It also meant that if you counted from there, you were expecting a mid-September harvest, which is almost normal, almost. Almost the old normal. Yeah.
And then it seems that once we get to, I guess, late June, that was pretty much the end of the rain. It stayed dry throughout July, most of August.
Yes, and late June, I was up at, what was bizarre was in Chablis, it actually had even hotter weather than the Côte d'Or. And I was up there tasting at the very end of June, and the temperatures got into the 40s. And we didn't really see 40 at all in 2020, but in 2019, there were 2 or 3 peaks that high, but it wasn't like 2003 when it was just consistently hot all the way through. So on the whole, the vines did manage to sort of, and the grapes managed to survive through that. There's a technical issue at the moment which people are talking about. Some of the unreconstructed guys are systematically leaf plucking their vineyards, and I think that is such a mistake at the moment. It guarantees you're going to get the hot sun on the grapes throughout the season. The more astute people are actually building up their canopies a little bit more. They're going wider at the top to make a sort of parasol effect. Because this is what's really key in 2018 through 20 and the years ahead. People have really got to react in their viticulture to make sure that they mitigate the effect of much hotter summers. We're seeing it from smart people already.
Yeah, just touching on that briefly. I mean, long term, do you think Chardonnay or Pinot will cope better with this change in climate?
I think Chardonnay will certainly cope because we've already got plenty of experience of relatively high octane Chardonnays making great wines in other parts of the world. I mean, Chardonnay is a grape you can grow anywhere, and I think there are really good wines from 11.5 alcohol through to 15.5. Of course, the style will change, and it may not be to everybody's palate to have these higher octane wines, but they'll work. So I don't think there's much fear there. It's more delicate. I mean, we've always said that it's a sort of a shy, thin-skinned grape that gets sunburn, and we know from elsewhere in the world that it typically hasn't worked in the hotter places. So it may change which of the vineyards which do best in Pinot. We're still a long way away from its real future being totally in doubt. But if global warming does continue and gets sort of extrapolated from where we are, it could be at risk. Then, of course, we'll be having Grand Crus in Kent and Sussex and Hampshire, so we'll take over.
And the joking that we had, about planting Grenache and Syrah may become a reality.
I don't think so, because there's no reason why the slopes that make such great Burgundy would make truly marvelous wine with other grapes.
Yeah.
Syrah has thrived best on acid soils. So there's no particular reason to think those grapes will do wonderfully well. But who knows? I mean, I think we have to hope that Pinot remains the grape and that people will manage it well enough.
Something, having spoken with growers over the last few weeks, something that I think they found particularly difficult in 2019 was deciding on the final picking date. And actually, those are going to become even more crucial. And it seemed 2019 it was incredibly crucial. Do you think people generally got it right? I mean, they both whites and reds. Yeah. There's an extraordinary freshness. I've never seen when I've been tasting on Primeur such richness with such freshness. That's a lot of it down to picking dates, I guess.
I think that we've known for a long time in whites that it's very important to have got your picking date right, because Chardonnay puts on sugar levels at the very end of the ripening in the way that Pinot typically has not in the past. So on that basis, people have realized that they've got to get the white date right. And only the reason why 14 and 17 have been such successful white wine vintages is because the window was wider than the other years. And then in 2018, we discovered the same was true of red, because until that point, up to and including 2017, you could count the 100 days from the flowering, the old method of doing it, and it was pretty consistent and it worked. After 2017, people were finding that because the flowering had been a bit earlier and because the summers were hotter, you were getting to a position in which either you got too much sugar or you got grapes which were wrinkling can be flétri in French, and giving you pruny, raisiny aromatics before the tannins and the physiological structure got right. So people are scratching their heads and wondering which way to go. I think the bright ones have gone for a compromise and have said, we can't wait for 100% physiological ripeness. We need to pick when there is still a decent balance. And that way we'll keep some acidity. We will get sugar levels which aren't too over the top. Importantly, we will get some fruit flavors which are still fresh enough. And if the tannins aren't 100% ripe, we can probably live with that. Because if you insist on waiting for full physiological ripeness, you're sort of saying that nobody made a good wine in Burgundy between 1959 and 1990. So I don't really go with that school of thought. The other thing which has come out of 2019, which I think is very interesting, is that this hot, dry summer, it seemed to concentrate everything. So yes, it has given you higher sugars. It won't be to everybody's cup of tea, but it's rare in 2019 that I find wines with an alcoholic heat, which has totally put me off. It's concentrated the fruit flavors and it's concentrated the acidity. So the dry extract, the fruit, the acid, and the sugar, they're all in a big register. That's going to give the wines a certain amount of puppy fat, which will make them appear, I use that expression, by the way, it's what David Peppercorn used to explain the 1982 Bordeaux's. And there is some relevance here. So they will seem, some of them, very attractive and almost gulpable when they're very young. But actually, to get the best out of this vintage, I think we're going to need to wait for the long term because it's going to have everything. And for me, a great wine is something where the fruit has had a chance to mature steadily and slowly, while all the structural elements, which supported at the beginning, but also perhaps masked the detail in the beginning, had their chance to soften and fall away and leave the fruit to do its own thing.
I was amazed sometimes when I'm tasting, particularly I think the white wines, where on the whole I'd say the alcohols are perhaps a little higher than the reds. I was amazed when I was told that some of them were at 14.5. I just didn't get that sense that they were as high as that because of that freshness. And I think also the dry extract, which was very, very prevalent this year, it seemed to give an added sense of freshness as well, a real salty quality, a real sense of what they would call sapidity, if you like, that mouth-watering element, which merely added to the freshness and actually gave the wines, particularly the white wines, an incredible balance. Once I got my head round the curiosity of the vintage, the fact that these were big wines and yet they were fresh, I loved them more and more. The more I tasted, the more I thought this is serious, and this is a vintage that will live a long time. Do you have a view on what it will do if we talk about the whites initially on post bottling a year or two afterwards? Will they close down?
Yeah, I'll just make a comment on a couple of the things that you've introduced there. I agree that I have the word salinity does appear surprisingly often, given the enormous weight on these wines. I think there are some terroirs which handle 14.5 anyway. So your Morachets and Batin Morachets, Merceau Charme, terroirs like that, it's not a problem. Puy Frisé and the Mâconnais, it's not a problem. I have a little bit more difficulty at the start of the range with people on their Bourgogne Blancs. If they appear at that level, then those can sometimes seem out of balance. And Chablis, it's really interesting because it does change. It still makes some lovely wines. I don't know. I mean, I do so believe that great white Burgundy needs to be given time. And I really hate what I hear when people are saying that we need to make the wines to age more quickly because that's what the customers want. You can tell me on the chat what your view is, but what I hear when I go visiting all around the world, people who love wine, they want to drink old bottles of wine more than they want to drink young ones. So I'm looking at it with I think, I think I've been doing this for 40 years, so I reckon I'm about halfway through my career now as well. And so I do want to have wines which are going to last well. I would there are a couple of questions on the chat. And Nick's asked, did wines feel more or less hot than the 18s? It's different between the red and the whites. But the white 18s didn't feel hot because the crop level was really high. And I said at the time that I felt it was a crop that had been saved by the size of the yield. Then along comes 2019, which is a small crop, but still actually does taste. I was worried initially. I wasn't expecting the wines to be as good as they are. But overall, in the two colors, there are many fewer aspects of volatility or of bacterial spoilage or of excess alcohol showing through. Having said which, I still think I absolutely fell in love with a lot of really successful 2018s, but there were more pitfalls. And it comes down to the vinification that on the whole, the fermentations went through more smoothly in 2019. It's not absolute. Certain producers managed their 18s perfectly and struggled in 19. Certain ones did well in 18 and 19, but are really struggling in 2020. But on the whole, 19 worked better than 18 in that respect, which will show through in how the wine's tasting today.
Yeah, I certainly found with the red wines that the sense of heat that one found on certain 2018s was not there generally in 2019. Yeah. Seemed to be much more harmony and much more sort of punctuation and definition, if you like. And I really enjoyed them. The best examples have wonderful energy, providing a real sort of persistence of flavour. And again, I found on the whole most alcohol levels on reds were somewhere between 13.5 to 14, rather where some of the whites were nudging 14.5. I didn't find that quite so often in the reds.
Yes, the whites are a wider range. Some of the whites are 12.5 and some were 14.5, and very occasionally more. Most of the reds are sometimes 13, 13.5, but more typically 13.5 to 14, and some at 14.5. And then it did start to show. A couple of people I'm thinking of are not people you work with, so I won't mention their names. I'll just mention for Maureen, who's put on the chat, will we see acidification allowed? It is allowed already. What you're not supposed to do to the same product is both acidify and chaptalize, but you certainly didn't need to chaptalize this year. Acidification is allowed. I ask people, some of them say a no, which I believe. Some of them say a no, which I don't entirely believe. Some of them say yes and mention this cuvee and that cuvee, or some say yes, I acidified 3 wines, see if you can spot them. Sometimes I do, but not always. When I'm writing about it, I've decided not, when people are honest and have told me they've acidified a couple of wines, I've decided not to mention that because it has a pejorative image, which is correct if you acidify too much to at the wrong moment and unsubtly. A few people just nudge and correct occasionally, and if I can't pick it up in the tasting, then I don't see why anybody should mind about it.
I remember when people acidified in 2003, almost as an afterthought, if you like. They suddenly went, "Oh my God!" And
strip the enamel from your teeth.
Yeah, the wine, you had the fruit, and then you had the acidity, and they never ever came together. And I think so many people who did acidify, the big error was getting the timing wrong. And it should have been done much sooner in the process.
Yes, you should do it at the start. Then the people who did do it at the start followed the analysis given to them by the enologists who were trying to make the final analysis come out like a standard year. And that meant they were putting loads of acidity onto unripe tannins. And the tannins weren't ripe in 2003 because the vines had shut down. They shut down much less in 18 and 19 and 20. Occasionally a bit, but they shut down less. So it's less serious. You're asking about whites. The comparison whites to 14 and 17, they aren't actually terribly like either of those vintages. They're like 15 with a little bit of 14 built into it. I suppose going back a long time, 1989 started out a bit this way. I just have a glass of Cremant de Bourgogne. It's just around. Thank you. To make sure I keep fluent as I talk. So yes, and you get 2014s have actually ended up tasting greener and greener in a way, not a way that I mind. It's going to keep them going a long time. 2017s are beautifully balanced, but 2019s are more powerful. Lots of yellow fruit notes, whether that's sort of plums. Yellow plums I'm happy with. Once you get into the peaches, White peaches I'm okay with. Yellow peaches I'm beginning to find taste. There are some flavors of super ripeness in some wines. But if that comes without a feeling of heat and alcohol, then I'm okay with that. It's a stylistic note rather than a sort of a markdown. The bizarrest thing is in Chablis, where I really didn't expect to get the full Chablis expression. In 2009, the warm summer hid it completely. It was actually there underneath, and they've been undervalued, 2009 Chablis, but in tasting them young, you couldn't see it. 2019, all of them have got 100% of that saline, sort of crushed oyster shell style about them. But some of them also have honeysuckle, peach, ripe melon aromatics alongside. And I'm going to be intrigued to see how those ones develop. That's only a few. The majority of them, I think, are going to be very exciting wines for sure. And some of them, it's just a question of how that balance will emerge.
What was your sense of the presence of terroir in 2019? Do you think the warm weather slightly overshadowed it? The richness of the wines? Not
really. No? In all honesty, I think the terroirs in both colours have come through pretty well. You know, it's a new norm. So the big plus point for 2019 is then that there is good freshness and indeed good acidity. There will be even better acidity in 2020 whites. But there's good acidity, there's good freshness. There is a proper sense of terroir, but there is this ripe style of fruit flavors, undeniably. And on the whole, most of the wines avoid excess heat and alcohol. So that's the general. Guys just asked about whether you think there are far too many disappointments in drinking older white Burgundy. Not if you wait long enough. It's in middle age where we've been through a period when they've let us down badly. I personally have found that a lot of vintages, which were almost always disappointing, I then just stopped drinking them, but I left the wines in the back of the cellar, and now they're doing far better. And if you go back to even village wines from 1979 or 1982, years like that, they're still on cracking good form. And I really think that 2009 is going to be a long haul vintage. There will be moments on the way when people say, oh gosh, they're getting too ripe, I think they're going to fall over, but they won't. They will rebalance later on. I think that seems almost always to happen. So I'm more of an optimist in that respect.
Just going back to red wines for a moment, I know you're a fan of whole bunch. This strikes me as a vintage where whole bunch potentially worked really well. The stems should have been ripe enough, and that added freshness and that they bring to the wine could only be beneficial. Did you share that view?
We've got a plus, a minus, and a plus. The first plus is that they taste fresher. The minus is actually using whole bunch changes the pH a little bit, so it gives you slightly less good acidity technically, even though it tastes as though the acidity is better. And then we finish on the plus that if you ferment open top fermenters with whole bunches, then you reduce the alcohol levels by somewhere between 0.2 and 0.5% alcohol. So that's probably a plus. As it happens, I like the aromatic profile of whole bunch. Not everybody does, but I do. So it's worked pretty well this year. We'll see more whole bunches probably in 19 than we will in 2020.
Yeah, there are one or two people who had their whole bunch levels quite high, which always makes me a little nervous. You know, even as high as 100% in places. And actually, I found that aromatic influence that the whole bunch has, which for me can be slightly overwhelming at times, wasn't there at all actually, and the balance was fantastic. The qualities that the whole bunch brings seem to be very well integrated into the character of the wine.
Yes, you won't get the herbaceous notes. And just as a side point for those of you out there who are maybe doing sort of MWs or diplomas, or Sarah who's scribbling away, even though she's already well past that. If you vinify with less sulfur, which is the case for many people these days, that is much less likely to bring out any herbaceousness in your whole bunch fermentation. So people are learning how to do this, and yeah, it's becoming more a part of the scene now, and it works for me.
Just one question on new oak. Did you feel there had been more used this year, and were the wines able to take it a little better because they had a more inherent richness?
And guess what? There's not going to be a straightforward answer to that, because there are lots of different schools going on. Some people use more new oak simply because they placed their orders and then they used less than they thought it was going to be. So that's one school of thought. Plenty of others used much less new oak because they said these wines are rich enough already. We don't want to add yet more to it. But frankly, if you did use more new oak, certainly in the whites, and I'm only just starting tasting Cotonnerie reds, in fact, the oak has got eaten up. If you've got that much richness, it's going to eat the oak up, no problem. And a sort of ancillary point, some people are giving the wines a longer élevage because they think these are powerful wines. And some people are going much shorter because they think there's so much showing in the fruit already that there is no need to keep them longer. So there are no two ways about it. The one person I tasted with today who is not one of yours, I don't think I'll mind if I say who it is favourably. As I was walking down from their offices to the winery where we're going to taste, one who's always very honest, said, "I love the reds in 2019s, but yeah, okay, the whites are fine, but I don't think it's a great year." And he hadn't tasted them for about 3 weeks. And as we were tasting them, his opinion was just changing in front of me. He said, "These are extraordinary. When I tasted them in the summer, they were just monolithic giants and they didn't seem to have all that much acidity. And I couldn't see what I love about Burgundy inside them. But now, just in the last few weeks, effectively since the harvest time, they've really opened up. And there were several wines there which I felt were way too early for bottling, and indeed they weren't going to bottle them. And it's quite important. So we have to taste now in October, November in order to get the notes ready for the January sales time. Frequently the wines which, when tasted in London in January when you can, it wasn't true of 2018, but it often is true, show better than they do in October, November. And back in the early days of merchants doing tastings, when I was with Morris and Burden, we actually did our tasting in March, and I always felt they were tasting better in March than they had done in January. Plus, of course, many more of the wines have been, if not bottled, at least assembled. So I see positives there. I think they're going to go on showing better. And we don't have the irregularities which befell some of the 18s. Having said which, I think a lot of the 18s are much better than they showed in London in January.
You mentioned bottling there. What's your view on what the wines will do post-bottling? I mean, there's a lot of wine in the wine, you know, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
It seems to me they're certainly potentially long-living in both colours, but will they shut down? That's the big question, I think.
No, I don't think so, not especially. If they do, I'll take it as probably a good sign rather than a bad sign. It won't worry me at all if they do. But when you've got wines with this amount of lush fruit and the fruit flavours are ripe, properly ripe, then I don't see why they will shut down. Richard has just asked on the chat how 2019 is going to look for the lesser appellations, and there, of course, is where you can start. And frankly, if we go back to my favourite vintage of now becoming an early generation, 2005, I'm still only drinking Bourgogne Rouge and just starting village wines in 2005 because they're getting ready and none of the others are even vaguely ready. So it's, I think, going to be a really good idea to look at baby appellations as well as the grape wines. And in the oak coat with Thibaut, his wines from the oak coat, you would never have seen that level of ripeness and depth of fruit even 5 years ago, as we got in his 2019s today, and you'll taste, I think, tomorrow. Yes, other areas, the back villages, your Auxey-Duresses, Montelys, Saint-Romains, great place to look. I think the Côte Chardonnay is already sort of well exposed, so I haven't tasted widely the 2019s yet, but it's not an area that needed to have the extra sunshine in order to do well. I think appellations of the grander sort, which are clearly enjoying the heat, would be Pommard and Chevrolet Chambertin, very much so. So yes, I mean, we can start to change the hierarchy of the map a little bit, I think, in the new normal, if we call 18 onwards the new normal. And for me, it's an absolute turning point, 18, and 19 and 20 confirm it. Prior to that, you had hot years like 2015, 9, 5, 3, but they were just the hotter end of the previous normal, and now we have a new normal.
Do you think the way people are farming, either organically or biodynamically, is helping to bring us a greater sophistication in the tannins on the red wines, and therefore that's also allowing, I suppose, appellations like Pommard to produce more sophisticated wines with silkier tannins, with also more fruit coming from the warmer summers?
Okay, well, lots of responses to that, but I'll do them all quite quickly if I can. First, it's the sunshine that's doing it first, whether you're organic or not. Secondly, many more people are becoming organic and or biodynamic, which I think is great. And including all the big companies. There's now, again, we've hit a turning point. And instead of just saying, oh, well, we're pretty much organic, but we don't go for certification. Now the big companies are realizing that they need to, or they'll lose market share. And the small domains, it normally takes a change of generation for that to happen. But there is quite a shift in generation happening in some of the famous names at the moment. So we're seeing many more people going in that direction. So the reason why the tannins could be rustic in e.g. Pommard is because if you've got these humid clay soils, you've got a little bit too much water, the vines are pumping the water up, that water is going into foliage development more than into grape ripening. And when you get that foliage development, that's where you get the slightly underripe tannins. And because you're not getting that water uptake, but there's still enough water to ripen the grapes in these areas, that's why the tannins are disappearing, becoming silkier. But you know, what I'm really happy about in my career with Burgundy is that if we count the start of the golden age from, let's say, 1985, obviously not everybody was up to speed then, but that was, for me, the beginning of really exciting domain bottle stuff on a bigger scale than just a handful of initial practitioners. Normally, 25 years, that brings us through from 85 to 2010, you normally see some complacency coming in. But really, I don't see it. I see the old guys, I mean, maybe I don't agree with everything they do, but the people who are my age, who were the young generation for such a long time, but now 60-something, they're mostly still developing, still interested, still desiring to do better. And I see a new generation of younger people, the people born in sort of 88 rather than 58, where for the first time I see a real shift and a new level of energy. So I'm looking through your names, you've got Amélie Berthaud, you've got Charles Magnat, Pierre Durocher is a tiny bit older, the young Gouge, Thibaut Clerget, absolutely, he's about that age, could be a touch younger, and so on. So there are lots of them who are really developing a whole new stride for Burgundy. It's encouraging. I'm happy.
No, I mean, it's very exciting. Funny enough, I was with Thibaut Clerget this morning, in fact, and he hasn't made a lot of Volnay, but it is rather nice. And it's some wines where he's, instead of 12 barrels, he's made 4. So it's going to make allocating wines rather tricky.
Well, we just had a question from Maureen there on the chat. Did you read it about that? Wanting to know the allocation going more to non-traditional Burgundy buyers. How are you finding pricing, by the way? What are people telling you about prices?
It's
no pressure here.
Yeah, it's quite mixed. Obviously, it's coming off the back of a good size vintage. So the cellars are perhaps a little fuller than they have been. And also, I gather some markets haven't yet shipped their 2018s. So the cellars are certainly fuller than they would normally be at this stage of the year. Against that, some producers have lost close to a vintage in 2 with 19 and 20. So there is a temptation for them to put prices up, but at the same time, they are realistic enough to realise that we're in a strange economic situation at the moment. So I think we'll see some small increases generally. One or two people might be forced into slightly heftier ones, but I think they're going to be relatively sensible.
I think so too. From the people most people I've talked to who said they've heard other people putting prices up, they're going to keep their prices the same. I saw two of your people yesterday in Chassagne-Montrachet, and both of to me they're along with Ramenet, they're my two favorite white domains in Chassagne-Montrachet. So I'm talking about Alex Moreau, domain Bernard Moreau, and Thierry Piot, domain Paul Piot, and they were both telling me that they were probably going to keep their prices the same. And Burgundy really needs to see sense. It's enough. They didn't bring the prices down with the two big crops of 17 and 18, which we could semi-understand after the misery of 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. But do not exaggerate it. Otherwise, there's going to be a kickback from the public, and rightly so.
Yeah, I think in many ways we found that the village wines have become almost problematic in terms of putting them on restaurant tables now. You're now, paying £140 for a young village Chassagne-Montrachet, which, 5-6 years ago would have been £70 or £80. And
well, you may be talking London restaurant prices, but they're not as bad as Bone restaurant prices. When it's the brand new vintage, 2018 is on the table, 5 times what they've paid for it. They probably haven't paid the producer yet. The producer has even delivered it to them by hand. And no, not prepared to go there. But what it does mean is that, as a humble wine critic, I don't earn the fortunes. And so I've had to go and find for myself really interesting wines from the lesser areas. And I drink those without compunction. And there's so much good stuff. There's loads to discover in the Mâconnais as well. It's not just classic Côte d'Or. Up in the Haute-Côte, several villages. In the 14th century, Ménoisset used to sell its wines more expensively than Volnay. I'm not going to recommend they do that now, but it's definitely a place with exciting stuff. So yeah, there's lots to look to. And indeed, the classic producers on your list, many of them have got some of the lesser appellations. And I've always really recommended people going for Bourgogne Blanc, Bourgogne Rouge from the top growers as a source of really good value wine. And yeah, I mean, after what you want as importers, Jason, is you want to have people buying right across the range, or at least you have enough people who buy across. It's not the individual who has to buy across the range, but you just need to make sure there are buyers throughout, and Burgundy justifies that now.
Well, I think what's so exciting about the young growers, and particularly a lot of the young growers that we have, is the level of ambition they have for what would once have been considered lesser appellations. Or, they were, they're Bourgognes and they're perhaps, village Fissau or Marcenais or something would almost have been an afterthought. Whereas now it's got their name on the label. They want to make something they can be proud of. And prices at that level have not moved a great deal, but the quality has jumped enormously. And I think I agree. I think there's some amazing value to be had.
You've got Marange at one end and Marcenais at the other end, and they're two appellations which are really growing.
Talking of villages, are there any particular village you feel have excelled themselves in 19?
I'm not sure I've seen a huge amount different from what I learned in 18, which is that Pommard and Gevrey are really worth looking at in a big way. Otherwise, corollary, is there anyone? It's actually surprisingly even in 2019, much more even than 2018. I suspect 2020 won't be completely even. So I don't think Savigny is interesting. The appellation of Clos Vougeot I'm really enjoying this year, and that's not a first, but it's not so easy. But all around the hill of Courton, Ladois, Allos Corton used to be one of the areas with the rustic tannins, which have got better. Pernod, the wines have filled out, and as long as they haven't lost their sort of chiseled, not austerity is a bit too far.
But they're grip, I suppose. Yeah.
Then I think some good wines in Pernod too, and nice stuff in Pernod. I think you have an underrated gem in Vincent Rappé, by the way. I think he makes really good wines in both colours. I don't know your man Le Broy in 70, but I shall make it a point in the spring to go and find out.
Yeah, talking of Clos Vougeot, actually, that's interesting because having said I tasted at Thibaut Clerget this morning, I think his Clos Vougeot was arguably one of the best I've tasted, actually. Incredible aromatic profile. Sadly, for all those watching, he made 4 barrels rather than 7, so there's going to be even less to go around than normal.
Priority should be given to people who are listening to the Zoom tonight.
Quite right, quite right. You've touched briefly on Chablis and the Mâconnais. How good are they, do you think?
Well, Mâconnais has the advantage that it's comfortable with higher alcohols. They did get quite badly frosted. I'm just amazed. There's work for you to do down there, Jason, because there are so many growers scattered around in odd little villages in the Mâconnais, which normally the wine buyers don't even get to, who are making wines from old 100-year-old vines, given 18 months élevage, maybe a whole bunch, probably sulfur-free, seeming, I mean, obviously a few people will have some deviations, but the smart ones are avoiding the deviations. And, you know, I'm just, I'm complètement bluffé, as the French say, particularly laughter. So I've seen lots of things to be excited with. I also think the Puy Frisé, with its upcoming Premier Cruise, is getting a bit of a limelight. And that, particularly if you're in the village of Frisé, you can easily cope with 14.5. It's the natural, 14 is the natural benchmark there. And the wines are not heavy in the finish. They're nice and bright and exuberant, but they're not heavy. And there are some spectacular people down there to take a look at.
Yeah, I've noticed, you know, in places like Fouissé and Vergisson, the slightly cumbersome old school style of Puy Fouissé is long gone, and there's so much vibrancy and energy,
absolutely,
and focus, and that sort of chisel quality that, in a way, you have to almost reevaluate what you think Puy Fouissé should taste like. It tastes a whole lot better now.
But it should have been several different appellations, but just one, but still.
I was particularly, I mean, we visited Chablis about 3 weeks ago. I was very impressed with what we tasted up there as well. It's certainly the most interesting vintage in Chablis for a little while, I think. Obviously, they've had difficulties with yields over the last couple of years. But there was very good ripeness, but great tension and you know, salinity again, I suppose. Very good typicity.
Yes. I think they're a little bit more worried in 2020. 2019 went through well for them. 2020, they started getting the berries being grilled by the sunshine. And in fact, sunshine reflected, because there was, the leaves didn't push out so much in 2020. You got sunshine coming down, hitting the white soil and bouncing back up, and even grilling their bottoms as well as their tops, but not in 2019. One or two people, but I think I'm just not yours. I'm thinking of a couple of people who are normally early pickers, who, because the acidity was holding up, picked later, and I don't really like the degree of super ripe flavors. But many people, the ripeness is balanced with absolutely this splendid freshness and really that feeling of licking the oyster shells. Yeah.
You touched on it briefly. There's just something else I wanted to mention. You mentioned about traditionally the rusticity in, say, an appellation like Pommard, where the slightly heavier clay soils would retain moisture, and actually too much moisture would go into the foliage, or if you like. The slightly more clay-rich soils this year, have they been beneficial because it was so dry? They actually retain vital water?
Largely so, yes. Rethinking slightly my view that with global warming, that quality was sort of climbing up the hillside. Because as you go further up the hillside, you get less topsoil, and there are a few cases where it's looking too dry. Has the benefit of the cooler winds, yes. But 18 a bit, and certainly in 19, I've been finding lots of wines which I really enjoyed lower down the slope because they were able to retain that humidity in the clay soils. So clay's done fine. And in fact, on the reds, a lot of people think that the whole bunch is more suited to a clay soil than it is to pure limestone. And so the mixture of having had a bit of water retention plus a bit of whole bunch has made some pretty smart wines from the lower soils.
The million-dollar question, and I think one that is impossible to answer, but is it like any other vintage?
No, because the game has changed with the global warming. It's so much more difficult than it used to be. I'm just answering on the chat. I did say Vincent Rappé. Earlier I mentioned Ramonet in a different context, but I did say Vincent Rappé. Yes, so what could it be like? So if we look at the hop vintages in the past, 2003 doesn't come into it, 2005 not really. There's a bit of 2015 in there, certainly. Bit of 1990 in there. But really, these days, things are out on their own. In white, again, I think I mentioned 89 a bit, 15 a bit, but no, it's breaking new ground. I just want to tell you a story about once when I was tasting the out of barrel, the 1983s in Prix Frisé, and I went to the Chateau de Frisé, whereas these days it's Antoine who makes the wines. Before that was his father, Jean-Jacques. And in 83, I got Marcel Vincent. Those are wines at 15.5 and alcohol and still with residual sugar. It's not to get really ripe. They had botrytis as well. But they were quite astonishing, quite unbelievable wines. And I mean, not to use them in a typical context, but even so, they were jaw-dropping. To Marcel Vincent, you know, there's never been a vintage like this. And he said, no, absolutely, what rubbish. The 1929s I made exactly like that. I checked afterwards, he was born in 1903 and it was him who made the 29s. Wow. It's nice to be able to pass on these stories across the generations.
What a brilliant story. Yeah, certainly neither of us, I'm pleased to say, have tasted the 29s. I don't think we're as old as that. Again, another impossible question, and I'm not sure where I fall on this. Where do we rank the vintage and how much do we like it? I guess you have to divide them into reds and whites. I mean, personally, I've been really impressed and surprised by the whites. And you mentioned earlier about how the size of the 18 dissipated the heat, and then we've had a small vintage, and that's kind of helped the freshness in 19. It's slightly counterintuitive, but it has done. The level of intensity and extract I find extraordinary, and I think the very best examples are stunning in whites. The reds are probably certainly much more Pinot for me than 18, and because of that, I love them, and I love the drive, the energy, and that sort of persistence of flavour. And I think there's so much substance that they will probably age really well and certainly outlive me. So I think potentially that they're both great vintages. Do you agree?
Yes, I do agree, but 18, there are deviations that you need to avoid. I think the greatest wines of 18, I'm going to stick my neck out and say I'm going to put ahead of the greatest wines of 19, but there are many more very, very good to superb wines in 19. There are fewer failures. It depends on what you like. So if you want wines which are sort of fresh and light and sort of the word ethereal, then these hotter vintages are less for you. And check what's left on the Stanley wine list and buy every bottle you can of 2017, which I'm liking more and more, but in a lighter style. However, as long as you're happy with a richer style, then 2019 is very good indeed. I'm guessing 19 will be better than 20 for reds. 20 has a chance of being absolutely sensational for whites. But I agree with you. I like the 2019 whites a great deal. There's more personality to them than 2018. I would say for sure.
Yeah, definitely more intensity. Just going slightly off piece there. You touched on 2017. I remember when we released the 17s, I was making comparisons with the 85s, which were before my time in terms of primeur. I think you just scrape into the having tasted them on primeur age bracket, Jasper.
Oh, easily. I was the best one, I think.
Yeah.
First vintage I tasted on primeur was 1980.
Yeah. Are there any similarities between 17 and 85? The reason I made the comparison was because every time I drank an 85 from even when they were young, they've been delicious, and they've actually aged really well because of their balance. And it seems 17 may be similar in that sense.
Yes, and I would bring actually 2000 into the mix, a vintage which we had no great hopes at the time, and we said you need to drink them in the first 5 years. And then after 5 years, we said they're doing really well, but drink them in the next. And even now, we say drink them in the next 2 or 3 years. 20 years old. So 85 had a bigger reputation at the time than 17 did or does. And probably the yields were higher in 17 than certainly they were higher than in 85. But both vintages were absolutely pure and clean without any rot. And those of you who've been following the study of this thing called resveratrol, which is what the grapes, it's something which appears on the skin of the grapes, which protects it against rot. However, in years in which there is no rot threat at all, like 85, it doesn't bother to produce itself. And the researchers back in the late 80s, in mid 80s, late 80s in Dijon University who were studying resveratrol, I remember them citing that as the sort of special character of the year. And it was the first vintage that I heard people saying, in order to make a bad wine in 85, you had to do it deliberately. A lot of people must have done it deliberately. No, it's a super vintage. But you're right, it was just lovely all the way through. And 17s will be lovely all the way through. And I don't mind drinking 17s now early. Typically, I hate infanticide on Burgundy, but I'm totally happy to drink 17s now or over quite a long future.
Is there a danger of us becoming overly critical, bearing in mind we have a plethora of great vintages and great wines? If you accept that 2013s on the red side are now coming round, I mean, it's been an amazing decade for Burgundy. Are we dismissing vintages that in any other decade would be considered very serious and putting them as almost also round?
No, I don't think so. Because all the way through, people have always found the new vintage to be lovely, and it's only later on that it then gets downgraded. I mean, I've never been a fan of 13 or 16 whites. In reds, not too bad. 12 I like. 13 is doesn't work everywhere, but when they're good, they're superb. 14 is pretty good in the Côte de Beaune. Not so good in the Côte de Nuit when they started panicking a bit with arrival of the Drosophila Suzuki and the rot that it brought. 15, rich and fabulous. 16, sensational and red. 17, I really like. 18, 19, 20, yes. So, no, I think at the moment we're getting really good vintages. You did send me in the briefing notes, will we ever have a bad vintage again? And certainly we will. But probably it will be a different sort of bad vintage from old bad vintages. We may get years where the heat just does do too much damage and the wines become unstable and or unsustainable. and we may get years in which there's too much rain at the wrong time. There is still a problem with, there is still a threat from mildew in the wet years, wet parts of the year, and oidium is resurfacing in the hot, dry years, because oidium develops when you have hot days and cool nights. And so that's something, it's quite manageable. It's normally not something that's going to run away with it, but it is causing a few headaches. It's something that has to be managed.
And I suppose the last question really, if this amazingly warm weather we've had over the last I suppose 5 or 6 years, pretty much, if that continues at the moment, I've seen you write it in, I think, in an article in your book. You're saying we're in a sweet spot of Burgundy at the moment. How much further can we go before we outgrow that sweet spot?
Well, I don't think too much further. I mean, it really does depend on how global warming gallops, if it's going to gallop. And we've had the reality check this year, and people have seen how beautiful the first lockdown was, with these wonderful unpolluted skies. People have traveled much less, and a few bits of that travel I'm sorry to miss, but much of it you start to realize that one can miss. And if we can change things, okay, this is not the moment to go into the philosophical stroke political rap, but I do hope that it is a little bit of a change of heart for people. And if we can make those changes and keep global warming no worse than it is at the moment, then I think we'll survive. But if it gallops away another 1.5, 2 degrees over the next 10, 15 years, then all bets are off. But we may have worse things to worry about than where our next glass of wine comes from.
Brilliant. Thank you, Jasper. I think we've covered an awful lot there in an hour. I think we've touched on one or two of the questions people asked on the chat room. So please all join us again, I think, in 2 weeks' time for our first tasting, which will be Meursault on the 24th. And thank you, Jasper. That was terrific. Fascinating to hear your take on things.
Well, thank you, Jason, and everybody out there, lots of you. It's been great talking to you, and please don't hesitate to sign up for Inside Burgundy, should you wish to, and you will get lots and lots of totally independent tasting notes on, there'll be, I haven't counted yet, but there will be several thousand different 2019s for you too. And
just remind us when the notes will be coming out, Jasper?
At stages, but so Chablis, I hope, before the end of this month, and then Côte de Beaune before Christmas, Côte de Nuits between Christmas and the New Year. That's what I anticipate.
Brilliant. Look forward to reading. Thank you so much.
Lovely to see you all, and meet again on some Zoom chat somewhere soon.
Thanks, Jasper.